Thank you, Alex. Thanks for having me, everyone. I could probably give a talk just on my bio. That would probably be in character, but I'm not going to today. And I should forewarn anyone who's wondering why there's Greenpeace crew member on the back of the computer. The computer belongs to my wife. I should say I'm privileged to follow Drs. Donnelly and Daintree, who touched on some of the things I talked about, and actually to follow from the, I can't open this, can I? To follow from the question about the Neanderthals, which I won't indulge too much on, but it does touch on the question of, what are we doing here? Who are we? The distinction between the surprised monkey and the surprised human being on the matter of whether it's a sentiment of surprise or whether he has some reason to be surprised. And I think that is something that the physical record can't really show, which is why what we try to do, or at least the Bible doesn't talk about human beings, it talks about Adam and being sons of Adam and the divine image and what that is. And I think we do need to reconsider what has been asserted perhaps imprecisely about what that consists in. For a few hundred years, we've considered that the rational soul, in Aristotelian Thomistic terms, is sufficient to explain that divine image. But then we see things that look like rationality, and so we jump the abyss and assume that therefore that's human. And in the same way, we degrade humans because we see rationality in orcas or in monkeys or in Neanderthals. I don't have an answer for you that's short enough because it'll detract from my already long speech. I didn't have time to write the short one. So today, yes, and on being a Jewish convert to Catholicism, I'm forced to jump the hyphen from Judeo-Christianity to just Christianity. For those who want to take up arms against me, I'm happy to indulge. And it is part of, I think, there is a sort of subtext that I won't touch on. Today I won't even touch really on the cultural elements of our liberal modern world, more just the political claims of liberalism and their broader anthropological context. But there is this question of, we talk about saving Western civilization, what is Western civilization? What is West? So hopefully I'm running roughshod over probably too many ideas in this talk, and I know we don't have much time for questions, but by all means ask me afterwards. But I will say, I'm here to say that the West is a kind of one of the devil's weasel words. It's a geographic term that has no substance, really, except if we mean west of Babylon. In reality, it's Christendom. And I am saying that boldly, and I say that with love for my Hebrew brothers and sisters, who are still my brothers and sisters, but they're also my brothers and sisters under Christ. Well, I'm under Christ, they're not. But anyway, that's an important point that, again, I'll touch on. But I do think when we ask the question, can we save Western civilization? In a sense, it's a yes and no. Whatever is Western is meaningless and will pass away. I think it will. What remains is up to us. And I think we have to return to identifying what this civilization is that's worth saving with Christ, his church, and yes, I think that's the Catholic Church, but we can also take that up at afternoon tea. So, liberalism, pyrrhic victory, or war by other means. Let me just introduce with two quotes. He who is not with me is against me. We all know who said that. Politics is war by other means. Okay, that's Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian general, who I will refer to as not just a military general, who anyone who studied political science would have come across as on war. I think taking on from René Girard's final book, Battling to the End, Karl von Clausewitz is a prophet of our time. I'll develop this idea, but today I'm talking firstly about liberalism. What is it? I'm not going to get into the cultural elements, but there are two philosophers whose principles really rule over us today under the banner of liberalism. The first is the Marquis de Sade, who said, "Today I want to wake up and marry a man. Tomorrow I want to be free to marry again, another man, but as a woman." Yeah, let's just work that one through, huh? We're all working that out today. It's like, what? Okay. Now the second great philosopher is Marx. Now not Karl, mind, but Groucho. Groucho said, "If you don't like my principles, I got others." So what do these two have in common? It's certainly not the principle of non-contradiction, the foundational axiom of reality and logic, which is eternally valid and knowable by the reason and the essence of truth. On the contrary, what is common to Marx and Sade is the unscrupulous contradiction, or in other words, conflict, which is the mechanism of change and therefore the essence of progress, which is change. And also, we often use the word modernity without understanding what we're really saying. It's from Latin modo in French. My wife is French and she's pregnant, by the way. I'll announce to everyone. It's our first child. Praise God. Modo means change or fashion, la mode in French. So we're really dealing with something that is essentializing change for its own sake. And I am trying to point to something about, well, what is the mechanism of change? And it is this contradiction or conflict. So behind every contingent good is a god. Behind every ideal or idea, an idol. They have the same etymological root. Behind every law, a lord, and behind every principle, a prince. So this refers back to this Maoist idea that power is from the barrel of a gun. So the Lord and Logos of truth, we call the Prince of Peace, and we hear in the prologue of John that he's a loving God, undivided yet triune, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. We don't hear that in the prologue of John, but in a stable relationship, which is very unmodern, as it were, and whose truth is a light shining in the darkness. Beginning with the first among the philosophers is Heraclitus, who coined the term logos, but he associated with, and not to overthrow Cicero, who is appealing to this law, nevertheless the law of the pagans, first coined by Heraclitus, he associated with polemos, which etymologically is linked to politics. What does polemos mean? It means war, or strife, or conflict, or the contradiction of opposites. Heraclitus also identified the Logos as the father of all and king of all. So the philosophers without the cross, in looking at nature and all of its interactions of the multitude of things, in that apparent nature of things, this interaction appears as a world of reciprocity, perpetual motion and change. And it's perennially dividing men, again referring back to Heraclitus, into hostile camps, masters and slaves. It makes masters of some and slaves of the others. Requiring, therefore, in order to have a stable relationship of order, which is what we talk about, oiko, the economy, means the household. It requires the exclusion of that which is outside of the household. It requires violent sacrifices to restore order. So the masters of might and power, and the livestock of leisure, and the philosophers of flux, change, these three are also one. It's a unholy trinity. But this is the principle of this world in action without the cross. And the prince of this world, we know, is the devil. The diabolos, the one who divides. That's the meaning of diabolos. Interestingly, he himself is divided. He's also Satan, the accuser. He's divided against himself, and as our Lord tells us, he cannot stand. But he doesn't mind. I heard it said recently, Satan hates his own servants. So we have to kind of be aware that crisis is the telos, is the purpose in this world. and some who master the mechanics of it succeed for a time, and those, the rest of us, become the livestock of leisure if we're lucky, the cattle. So liberalism. Liberalism is the symptom, not the crisis. Today I only want to give a very cursory critique of liberalism, and I will refer to Christopher Ferrara's important book, The God That Failed. Not in any detailed or plaintive way, but more of a sort of unveiling, not what it claims to be and do, which we're all starting to see clearly today, excuse me, but what it actually is, and how these exoteric claims and their esoteric elements are internally inconsistent, yet fundamentally fit for purpose. I wish to place it more surely in the context of this anthropology and theology, centred especially on what I and others have long claimed is the fundamentally religious or sacred reality of our nature, which shall draw upon either war as its logos or truth. So the crisis of the modern West is not the result of liberalism failing to live up to its ideals, nor the result of liberalism abandoning its original principles. Rather, this sort of globalised state capitalism, sort of post-Fordist, I heard it said, merged with this contemporary egalitarian secular progressivism is the logical maturation of those original principles. So after exposing these contradictory principles, I wish to make the bold claim that the original or esoteric principles behind liberalism are essentially negative. They're designed or stumbled upon by sort of naive and ignorant, I shouldn't say ignorant, but naive 17th and 18th and perhaps 19th century thinkers, with the chief purpose of co-opting and supplanting the reign of truth manifest in the West as Christendom and in particular the Catholic Church, and the social kingship of Christ. Supplanting it with power, and of course power is blind, it will take any form, which I'll come to, and therefore that being in itself self-contradictory and fundamentally denying God, is neutral, impartial, and even tolerant about the destructive or tyrannous regimes that must ineluctably succeed it. And in this sense, Karl Marx, the other Marx, he was prophetic in the material realm, in understanding that capitalism is a handmaiden for socialism and communism, that the interactions of capitalism will lead to a certain change. There's a certain pagan eternal return of the same that Karl Marx was anticipating there. I digress. So I want to suggest something more fundamental and apocalyptic, if you will, which I don't believe the best and brightest of the liberal ideologues, or any ideologue for that matter, save for the most resentful and psychopathic, would have foreseen. Liberalism and modernity has not only not made humanity more peaceful, which is one of its claims, or less violent, rather, by dissolving traditional structures that once contained violence under the aegis of liberation, because of course every liberation from one obstacle under the spirit of liberation requires searching for the next obstacle to be liberated from. It has brought us ever closer to an era of absolute war, which with the advent of nuclear weapons has made it a concrete historical reality in the same measure that we can no longer dare to think about it and pretend instead that we live in perpetual peace. So if you caught the drift of my reference to Clausewitz, no doubt developing the insight of Heraclitus, war is the permanent state of nature and natural man, passing through periods of only relative containment. Before the next salvo, I'm not sure what that is, Clausewitz glimpsed the inherently apocalyptic nature of this logos of war when he made the following prophetic remarks. War is an act of violence to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. War is nothing but a duel on an extensive scale between combatants who reciprocate every action in escalations of violence which have no logical limit. He who uses force unsparingly must obtain a superiority if his adversary does not act likewise. But by such means, the former dictates the law to the latter, and both proceed to extremities, to which the only limitations are those imposed by the amount of counteracting force on each side. So the only limit to human violence is prudential and temporary cessation of fire while we strategically sort of re-employ our means to renew the fight again. Okay. So what is liberalism? Back to liberalism. I call it the lighthouse of conscience, of course, which becomes the lord of the flies. The problem of political philosophy is fundamentally of two orders. What is the good, and how should the good be implemented and preserved? That's one. And how to respond to disputes about the good and the fact of diversity within a society and under whose authority. So liberalism purports to solve the crisis of authority that arises out of the Protestant Reformation, which is really the first liberation from the obstacle, or the scandal, if you will, of the Catholic confessional state, that the state claims to know the good and is therefore obliged to implement it. Well, I don't agree with that conception of the good, so I'm going to, if I'm not going to obey, I'm going to rise up. Now, John Milton, who was an early Protestant, wrote in Paradise Lost famously, non serviam, I will not serve, and he put those words in the mouth of the devil. I'm not saying Protestants are the devil's minions, but we do see a centuries-long progress, but it's not simply from the 16th century, as we heard from our previous speaker. This begins in the Garden of Eden. I will not serve. All right, so it's a fundamentally human disposition. So liberalism, for a short time, offers us peaceable coexistence through a, let's call it a individuating of authority by reference to the conscience. The individual conscience becomes the universal lighthouse, which leads the way for men separated by war and disagreement, who are now lost at sea. But it's led to the dissolution of hierarchies, the imprisonments and executions of their figureheads, starting with the Pope, then kings, today fathers, and tomorrow, with transgenderism as its most perverse example, even the so-called sovereign self, he's now divided against himself, as Marquis de Sade wished it to be. Because really what we're dealing with is not conscience, because conscience that is not well formed is, as we heard from Mr. Peter August earlier, is subject to the influence of desire, the world, sin, the flesh, the devil. So we also see in liberalism this, therefore, strange bipolarity. On the one hand, this liberation of conscience, which, of course, 400 years ago, well-formed Christians, be they of a Protestant or Catholic confession, were nevertheless pretty well-behaved people. But fast forward to today, and we see licentiousness supplanting liberation. So where that licentiousness is protected under the name of liberty, we must also therefore see a reliance on seemingly anti-liberal and authoritarian measures, either indoctrinating the conscience in conformity with the will of the state for the purposes, the goals of liberalism, which is essentially peaceable coexistence in a sea or in a multitude of competing ideas of the good, or simply to force people to betray their conscience in the service of protecting whatever freedom has now entered the liberal orthopraxis, such as gay wedding cakes. So how did this happen, and how come it doesn't seem to trouble liberals? Well, let's recall the pithy remark of the US founding father and anti-federalist James Madison, who said, "If every Athenian had been a Socrates, nevertheless every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob." The point being is that, yes, well, perhaps I think you get the point. Okay. So liberalism is not just, which I'll come to, a doctrine, which I've claimed is a doctrine that's self-contradictory, but that is in fact its method for success. It is also a theological revolution, a political religion founded on the rejection of the truth and the worship instead of consensus. What is consensus? It's only a facsimile of truth and a device of power, and which is really nothing more than the tacit threat of the majority against the minority, which once established becomes an orthodoxy the facsimile of truth is then shared by everyone who's afraid or cowardly of the barrel of the gun. And over time, we get Lysenkoism we saw in the Soviet Union. You get the total abolition of the truth in science, and instead you have party, the word of the party. And this is Orwell's vision in 1984. So it's really a replacement theology. Its central move is replacing God, revealed truth, the church, and objective moral order with autonomous individual choice, state neutrality, the pose of state neutrality, procedural justice, and rights detached from truth. Hence, liberty becomes sacred, not subject to the good, but the good in itself, which I'll develop when I talk more about the conscience. Excuse me. The modern state does not become neutral. Rather, it establishes a new public religion, the liberal state religion. The dogmas of that state include freedom of conscience, religious equality, secular public reason, and individual autonomy. So instead of Christ being king from the Catholic point of view through the magisterium, the traditions, the teachings of the church, conscience is king, which of course begins at the time of the Reformation with the certainty that the conscience was formed by Scripture and by Christian culture. We can no longer rely on that. So the most salient feature of human existence from an observer's perspective is this violent conflict. And we have these intellectual developments coming out of the Renaissance, beginning with William of Ockham, who's probably influenced by Islam, whose doctrines of divine will as superseding the this is what we call nominalism and voluntarism, where the will of God is the paramount attribute of God, and therefore whatever God says is good. God can change the law of reality, this is Islam, at any moment. And those intellectual debates generate increasing skepticism. So we then have, and with skepticism you have atheism, or at least a suspicion that priests and churches are just another power in a struggle for power. So chiefly liberalism draws from two quasi-atheists, one Hobbes, who's probably an atheist, Locke, who's a nominal Christian, but they saw the people as a source of sovereignty because they no longer believed in the claims of the church. And so drawing upon the intellectual faculty of reason, which is what the pagans did, so Stoicism, it is a sort of universal, and the moral sense, so they're both individual and universal faculties in different ways. And their conclusion was that every man's conscience is his ultimate universal authority, and that the reasonable ends of politics is merely peaceable coexistence, that society is no longer an organic whole, and the common good is no longer united to a transcendental idea of the good, but simply the common good is now reduced to whatever sustains the division or diversity of comprehensive doctrines of the good between men who differ and disagree, preventing them from going to war. So the idea of a judge over the good higher than the conscience, i.e. the church, is not only abolished but impugned as absurd, which we see today. So with liberty then, with conscience as the good, liberty becomes the God, because the authority of conscience is now sovereign, so the liberty of conscience is conceived as the highest good. It follows that by respecting people's interest merely in living according to, or at least not in conflict with their moral sense or conscience, a free society is one who just protects people's right to associate or go their separate ways. The separation becomes the celebration. Liberal theorist Charles Larmor, he states it plainly. Liberalism is thus seen as the art of separation, opposed to the idea of society as an organic whole. So we move from coercion, the problem of coercion, which follows from a comprehensive idea of the good. So this is what the Protestants chiefly were rebelling against if they weren't just expropriating church property. Just kidding. The highest virtue is toleration. and we heard it mentioned, and I'll come back to Scruton's brilliant insights about toleration. Of course, we can draw back to Karl Popper, who talked about the paradox of toleration. Should we tolerate the intolerant, which I'll come to. So the conceit of liberalism lies in viewing itself merely as this political order theory rather than as itself a substantive moral doctrine of the person and of the good transcendentally. And it's reflected in toleration, which derives chiefly from Locke. If a free society is one where the liberty of conscience and of association and disassociation is fundamental, then there's no reason on principle to assert any other rights or values. There is instead every reason to tolerate all kinds of diverse associations and values. There are only practical considerations. Practical considerations. So we go back to, if you recall what Clausewitz said, that the limits, there aren't any. There are only pauses for practical considerations. He was talking about war. Here we're talking about politics, and I suggest that it's the same thing. The marketplace of ideas and the cult of reason. So toleration takes precedence because, as the Enlightenment view prevails here, the circumstances of disagreement in the absence of any authority. So there's the chief conceit, the absence of any external objective authority. We've internalized it and individuated it. The absence of any authority to establish the correctness of one moral standpoint, liberalism appeals to a universal audience in the court of reason. If reason is the authority that we appeal to in public, then toleration becomes so important because, as Immanuel Kant claims, should reason limit freedom of criticism by any prohibitions, it must harm itself. Reason has reason has no dictatorial authority. Its verdict is simply the agreement of free citizens. Again, so we see consensus taking precedence over truth. So what are the actual ideas of the market? Well, they can and they have and they will be absolutely anything. So many conservatives will blame some of the purveyors of these absurd ideas that led to the French Revolution, chiefly Voltaire and Rousseau and Jacobinism. But Christopher Ferrara makes the point, which I support, that this misses the point. The real revolution occurs earlier. It's in Locke, and where Locke quietly removes the entire metaphysical foundation of Christendom, Locke changes the purpose of politics from the cultivation of virtue to the protection of individual rights and property. So we move from the idea of the soul being something to, how shall I say, sanctify across time in order to enter heaven, to the body that has claims against the world. And so we move from the supernatural, or supernaturalist to a naturalist orientation. So once this shift occurs, everything else follows logically. The sexual revolution, abortion, same-sex marriage, gender ideology, they're not deviations, they're consistent developments. And so we heard, if some of you are familiar with the work of post-liberals, there's prominently now in politics, I don't know whether he's a consistent post-liberal or not, but J.D. Vance. But he is reading, in America, Chad Pecknold and Patrick Deneen. I encourage you to read their work. Patrick Deneen's thesis is that on the content of the ideas it tolerates, liberalism has succeeded rather than failed. But it has failed us. So it's internally consistent with respect to the rules of the game. I'll come to that. But the purpose is to have division, is to permit the endurance of division, so long as it can masquerade as a peaceable coexistence. How long that peaceable coexistence can last, we're about to find out. So this is the pyrrhic victory. We know that there have been internecine disputes about the potential limits of toleration. Those who call themselves liberals in the US, we call them lefties, they're squeamish about living in a society that has this sort of archipelago of infinite perversions, just as conservatives resist any attempt by the left to establish group rights or to impose liberal values on diverse and free persons and associations. The other element that really has to be addressed is what about existential threats to the liberal state? this is the question of how to tolerate the intolerant. Should we be intolerant? On this read, it's enough for people and groups simply not to object to coexistence, as I said. And if they do object, if they have strong comprehensive doctrines that are incompatible with this morass of peaceably coexisting perverts, they have a choice. The liberal view grants them this choice: secession or submission. Now, secession didn't really work out for the South in the US Civil War. And in fact, John Locke himself said that although the principle of the liberal state is founded on the liberty of conscience, once the state itself is founded, Jean-Jacques Rousseau said something similar, that the state is now the incarnation of the true and general will and can no longer tolerate secession, should no longer tolerate. So we have another paradox there. So what about groups who aim at unifying the broader community according to their moral standpoint rather than seceding by expanding numbers or influence? What about groups who actually intend to employ the apparatus of state power to do so? What and who in principle decides what these practical limits are? What are the practical limits and on what principle? Well, I'm telling you that there are no practical limits because the other paradox of liberalism, which purported to respond to what it conceived of as coercive state power or the tyranny of the state, it nevertheless reserves to the state the absolute discretion to punish anybody from time to time that it decides is not a worthy participant of the court of public reason. Now, what's the principle behind that? It's because toleration itself, a good liberal will argue, toleration itself requires that the regime of toleration protect itself. We've seen this, again, how is it employed and how is it not employed? It's employed against people who don't want to bake cakes for gay weddings. It's employed against the Communist Party in Australia in the 50s. But it's not employed against fundamentalist Islamic jihadis who were welcomed back here with ticker tape parades, and so on and so forth. You can use your imagination. There are countless examples. The state, being based on this principle of toleration itself, it's the very apparatus liberalism purporting to free us from. It is nevertheless the very same said thing. I'm not saying it's absolutism in practice, but in principle, it's essentially the same. That what is sovereign is the liberal state, and the liberal state can and will do anything, including becoming illiberal, ironically. So I tell you these things today because perhaps I should have said at the beginning, my purpose for you is to discredit liberalism. I think, so to go back to the beginning, I was raised secular Jewish, and when you're Jewish, you can become anything, a capitalist, communist, whatever. So long as you're Jewish, it's fine. And so I did, in fact, move from communism, I consider it academic Marxianism, but to hedonism and Nietzscheanism, and then I went back to study because I wanted to know what the truth was, and that's how I studied liberalism. I was a good liberal. I worked in the Labor Party under John Brumby here, and we were doing the Assisted Reproductive Treatment Act, expanding IVF to same-sex couples and single people, including homosexuals. And then I worked on gambling regulation reform, and I started to have a peak of sentiment, which I later understood was conscience. And that led to 15 years, or 10 years of study and exclusion. I excluded self-exclusion and entry into the Catholic Church. So I say that because I want you to know that I was a liberal. I'm sorry. But I also want to say that, am I good for time? I forgot to turn my 5 minutes. All right. I forgot to say that we are all liberals now, that this is a religion, it's a state religion. So I want to impress upon you that the first thing you need to do is to accept that you are swimming like those two fish who meet And one says, "How you doing, John?" And the other fish says, "Great. How's the water today?" And the fish says, "What's water?" Liberalism is the water we're swimming in, and it intends to subvert and pervert and change to make you good citizens. Napoleon himself said it. This is why they established we're talking about education. The education system we have now, thanks to Napoleon and the Prussian military, was designed to create not free people, but liberal citizens, which is to say citizens of the liberal state, which is to say citizens of this religious entity. I'll skip over that. So we know about the heresies and blasphemies against the state. I want to say the false hope of conservatism and populism. What it means, conservatives are limited in the system to complaining about the effects and monetising their complaints. Conserving the progressive agenda, gained only a few years prior. Whinging passively, becoming voyeurs in the increasing obscenity of their own existence. Welcome to country is basically a blasphemy, and that sort of welcome to country. I recently read an article about a guy who was prosecuted for doing donuts on a rainbow flag pedestrian crossing. So that was pretty good. So that we can see the persecution is here, it's real, and I'm trying to tell you that this is indigenous to human nature. This is the war. This is the logos of war, and it resolves itself first. It's the division that we name under the devil, and then the accusation, which has the name of Satan, by exclusion. That way it reproduces order, but it is a violence. It's a violence that orders violence. So finally, just to come back to toleration, we heard it said from a former speaker about Scruton, tolerance is extinction. We're taught constantly we must tolerate, but it's the very mechanism, the collapsing of meaningful distinguishing principles and categories and peoples by which the tolerant are extinguished. And of course, neither the Nicomachean ethics of Aristotle nor the traditional teachings of the church place tolerance among the virtues. So what's to be done? I'll keep it short. Okay, if original sin is the ultimate cause, then the ultimate and only answer is Christ and the social kingship of Christ. The Catholic position before the Vatican Council consistently rejected religious indifferentism, state neutrality, and liberal constitutionalism. The state must acknowledge Christ's kingship, not merely the private religion of Christianity, because of course Christianity has been levelled. The peaceful coexistence is like the rendering of the pyramids into sand, where everything just becomes the desert. No, we have to rebuild our temples and worship in them. And I want to quote, Pope Benedict did say the church is going to retreat. We can see the forces are immense. It's going to retreat to perhaps the level of the persecuted church of the early centuries. I want to go back to René Girard to quote him, not in a glib way, but in his final work, Battling to the End, he was described in that work as seemingly pessimistic and perhaps cavilling with futility, and whether he had an answer. He retorted, the only thing to do is to become a saint. By extension, prepare to be a martyr. Cardinal George, the former Archbishop of New York, reminding us here to recall the strange fate of the late Cardinal George Pell. When asked what he thought about dying, he remarked, I'm lucky, I get to die in my bed. My successor will die in jail, and his successor will die in the public square. So, in conclusion, are we Westerners? As I said, if so, then we're all liberals. We're all liberals now. All the while, liberalism is branching off before our eyes from the doctrine of peaceable coexistence between disputing Christians to now this sort of post-Fordist, global state capitalist nightmare merging with egalitarian progressivism, which I coin branch Covidian. I'd like to say something controversial, but I hope it's illuminating. That is, we ought to conceive ourselves not only as liberals, but we ought to understand that we as liberals are in the same context as those that we call Muslims from the 6th to the 10th century. Without opening up too big a can of worms, the context was that they were in fact disputing sects of Christians, Jews and Judaizers. And it was only many centuries later that in this sea of diverse and competing ideas of the good, that the political solution of Islam was finally formed. Liberalism is going through a similar strange progression, and I want to call your attention to the rise of Islam. At the moment, thanks to the internet, there is incredible scholarship and very illuminating discoveries. For example, we're seeing well, I won't go into that too much, but I do suggest that we, as a cautionary tale, we study a little bit more about the rise of Islam and understand that what's happening today is quite similar. Where am I? Non-political, continuing with plurality. Sorry. Yeah, so this idea of, first, if you think you can put Jesus and his church back in the box, like Islam has done, like liberalism is currently doing, that is the process and the means by which the society transforms itself into some other religion. We don't know what it will be, whether it will become its own religion or whether it will be overtaken by an existing and powerful form of it. But it will be a state religion, and a state religion is always a false religion, and it will eventually wage open war on Christians. There can be no separation of church and state. To quote John Milbank, the rather good Anglican theologian, he's good because he's a theologian, not because he's Anglican. Just kidding. Only a global liturgical polity can save us now from literal violence. Okay, I just do want to end on one quote from Blaise Pascal. This is an extraordinary quote, and then I'll leave it to Alex. The struggle in the Pensée, he just wrote some fragments. This is titled "The Struggle of Violence Against Truth." The war in which violence endeavours to crush truth is a strange and insufferable one. All the efforts of violence cannot weaken the truth, but only serve to exalt it the more. The light of truth can do nothing to arrest violence. Nay, it serves to provoke it still more. When force opposes force, the more powerful destroys the less. When words are opposed to words, those which are true and convincing destroy and scatter those which are vain and false. But violence and truth can do nothing against each other. Yet let no one imagine that things are equal between them, for there is this final difference, that the course of violence is limited by the ordinance of God, who directs its workings to the glory of the truth which it attacks. Whereas truth subsists eternally and triumphs finally over its enemies because it is eternal and powerful like God himself. Thank you very much.